People often believe that severing the roots is the surest way to kill a mighty tree. They assume that without its anchor in the familiar soil, the heavy trunk will simply wither, the sprawling branches will snap under the weight of the winter wind, and the green leaves will crumble into meaningless dust. They do not realize the profound, quiet truth of nature. That is precisely the moment the surviving core begins to push deeper into the dark, unforgiving earth to find a magnificent, hidden underground spring. Clara Whitmore was 73 years old. She had spent 38 years standing before dusty chalkboards as a dedicated schoolteacher, patiently shaping the minds of thousands of children who had long since grown and forgotten her name. She had devoted 42 years to a marriage built on quiet devotion, rough, calloused hands, and the enduring scent of fresh pine. She had stood shoulder to shoulder with her late husband, Arthur, mixing concrete and driving steel nails to build their modest, beautiful life from the ground up. She knew the exact creak of the third wooden step on her front porch. She knew precisely how the afternoon sun filtered through the ancient oak trees to warm the braided rug on the living room floor. It was gone. She stood on that very porch after a routine morning medical checkup, her weathered hand resting on a brass doorknob that stubbornly refused to turn. The familiar jagged key scraped uselessly against the heavy metal of a brand new lock. The thick wooden door creaked open just a fraction of an inch, revealing the pale, nervous face of her own flesh and blood. Evelyn, her only daughter, stood safely behind the threshold with a cowardly gaze that flickered rapidly between deep guilt and cold calculation. A battered leather suitcase was shoved unceremoniously through the narrow gap, landing with a dull, heavy thud against the painted wooden floorboards. It held the pathetic, meager remnants of a lifetime of honest work: 3 faded cotton dresses, a worn leather Bible with yellowed pages, and Arthur's heavy silver pocket watch that had long stopped ticking. "You need to go to a nursing home, Mother," Evelyn murmured weakly, her eyes darting away to stare at the floor. Before Clara could even draw a slow breath to speak, the heavy, suffocating scent of cheap cologne announced the domineering presence of her son-in-law, Desmond. Desmond stepped into the doorway, pushing his wife aside, his posture reeking of false authority and desperate, ugly greed. His tailored wool suit could not hide the faint, pathetic trembling in the hands of a man drowning in exactly $68,000 of underground gambling debt. He held up a thick stack of crisp white legal papers, his thin lips twisting into a cruel, mocking smile. "It is a legal power of attorney, Clara," Desmond stated coldly, tapping the document with his manicured finger. "You are not fit to manage this estate anymore. We are selling the property this week to clear the accounts." They had forged the signatures in the dead of night. They had stolen the house. They were throwing her onto the concrete to save themselves from utter ruin. Clara did not scream. She did not fall on her knees in despair, nor did she hurl bitter curses at the pathetic man who was currently robbing her of her lifelong sanctuary. She simply stared at them. Her sharp eyes, weathered by decades of immense life and quiet loss, held a chilling, silent dignity that made Desmond instinctively flinch and take a clumsy step back. She saw them for exactly what they were: hollow, cowardly creatures, trading their fragile souls for a brief, temporary reprieve from their own miserable failures. The door slammed shut. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot through the still morning air.
Clara stood completely frozen in the silence, the crisp autumn wind tugging sharply at the fraying edges of her gray wool cardigan. She slowly reached down, her aged, permanently calloused fingers closing securely around the worn handle of the heavy suitcase. At the bottom of the porch steps, an old hound with a snowy gray muzzle let out a soft, questioning whimper. Barnaby was 12 years old, his left hind leg stiff and permanently crippled from severe arthritis, but he had never once left her side. Clara knelt down, resting her heavy hand on his warm, coarse fur, feeling the steady beat of his loyal heart. She slowly opened her faded leather wallet. Tucked carefully inside the frayed fabric was her entire remaining fortune in this vast world. $27. It was an absolutely laughable sum, an insulting amount that would barely buy a decent hot meal at a roadside diner, let alone a sturdy roof over the tired head of a 73-year-old woman. She calmly closed the wallet, tucked it securely into the deep pocket of her heavy coat, and picked up her bag. She did not shed a single tear. She did not look back at the imposing house. She did not glance at the pristine flower beds she had tenderly cultivated for over 4 decades. She walked. Clara and Barnaby moved in absolute silence, stepping off the soft grass onto the unforgiving, burning asphalt of the gray highway. The bright sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, beating down relentlessly on her narrow shoulders, but her proud posture remained perfectly straight. Heavy trucks and fast cars sped past them by the dozens, kicking up thick, choking clouds of dirt and dark exhaust, completely ignoring the slow, deliberate procession of the stoic woman and her limping, panting dog. They walked for over 2 grueling hours. The flat soles of her sensible leather shoes offered almost no protection against the punishing hard road. The relentless, burning friction soon began to wear straight through her thin cotton socks until warm, stinging blood began to blister and seep heavily from her cracked heels. Every single excruciating step was a brutal, physical reminder of her sudden, devastating exile from the world she knew. Yet her lined face remained an unreadable mask of absolute calm endurance. Then she saw it. A few miles away from the roaring, heartless highway, a narrow, nameless dirt road cracked and splintered off into the dense, overgrown woods. It was a dark path entirely swallowed by decades of neglect, choked by thick, thorny weeds and towering ancient oak trees that blocked out the bright sun. Something primal, silent, and entirely unexplainable pulled her exhausted body toward it. She turned off the asphalt. The air immediately grew heavy and cold, thick with the pungent scent of damp earth and rotting pine needles. She walked slowly for several hundred yards until the muddy dirt path ended abruptly in a silent clearing suffocated by long, creeping shadows. Clara finally stopped, her bleeding feet completely numb, her shallow breath pluming in the sudden cool forest air. Looming quietly before her was a massive, dark silhouette. It was entirely devoured by creeping ivy and thick, thorny vines, a forgotten, rotting tomb left to decay in the deepest, most isolated depths of Oakhaven. She stood frozen before this desolate ruin of dead wood, completely unaware that this forsaken, tragic pile of dead wood was about to resurrect her entire existence.
The structure was a rotting carcass of a cabin, completely abandoned to the merciless elements for 15 long, silent years. Every single pane of glass had been shattered by thoughtless vandals or brutal winter storms, leaving jagged, empty holes that stared blindly into the creeping darkness. The wooden floorboards were completely buried beneath a thick, foul-smelling layer of damp oak leaves, rusted tin cans, and the decaying remnants of long-dead forest animals. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the thick canopy of trees, plunging toward a bitter 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Clara stepped inside. She did not cover her nose against the suffocating stench of mildew and rot. She silently cleared a small, relatively dry space in the corner, using the side of her worn leather shoe, her bleeding feet throbbing with a dull, relentless agony. She found a rusted, collapsing canvas cot shoved haphazardly against the moldy wooden wall. She dragged it out, dusted it off with her bare hands, and sat down. Barnaby rimped over, shivering violently in the freezing draft. Without a single word of complaint, Clara unclasped her heavy leather suitcase and pulled out one of her 3 remaining dresses. It was a thick, sensible navy wool garment she had worn to church for over a decade. She gently wrapped it around the trembling 12-year-old hound, tucking the edges securely under his crippled leg. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a stale, crushed granola bar she had carried for months. She carefully broke it exactly in half. She fed one piece to Barnaby, chewed the dry, tasteless remainder herself, and lay down on the filthy cot. She closed her eyes. The morning light was a harsh, unforgiving gray that sliced through the shattered windows and illuminated the absolute squalor of her new reality. Clara woke up stiff, her aging bones aching intensely from the freezing dampness of the ruined floorboards. She reached into her purse and pulled out her old, cracked cell phone. The screen lit up with a single, glowing message. It was from Desmond. "You always were a stubborn pauper," the message read, dripping with the arrogant, cowardly venom of a man desperate to justify his own pathetic thievery. "Don't come crawling back when you freeze to death out there." Clara stared at the glowing words. She did not type a furious reply, nor did she hurl the phone against the rotting wooden walls in a fit of despair. She simply pressed the power button, plunging the screen into total darkness, and placed it back into her purse. She had far more important work to do. She stood up, ignoring the shooting pain in her blistered heels, and walked back out to the desolate dirt road. She left Barnaby sleeping soundly under the wool dress and began the agonizing 3-mile trek to the Oak Haven County Administration Office. The county clerk was a young, soft-handed man with a condescending smirk, a perfectly ironed pastel shirt, and an expensive silver watch that glinted brightly in the fluorescent light. He chewed his gum loudly, leaning back in his comfortable leather chair as he looked down at the mud-caked shoes and frayed gray cardigan of the 73-year-old woman standing quietly across the counter. Clara calmly requested the public land records for the unnamed dirt road. The clerk scoffed, lazily typing on his computer keyboard. "That parcel has been a dead zone for over a decade, lady," he muttered dismissively, shaking his head with a mocking, cruel laugh. "It is totally ownerless. The original owner died, and it has been carrying a forgotten, worthless tax debt ever since. You want to claim a pile of rotting wood and snake nests?" "I wish to pay the transfer fee and assume the outstanding taxes," Clara stated evenly, her voice carrying the unmistakable commanding cadence of a veteran schoolteacher. The clerk rolled his eyes, printing out a single, flimsy sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished mahogany counter with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "Suit yourself," he sneered coldly. "That will be exactly $8 for the administrative transfer fee." Clara unclasped her worn leather wallet. She did not show a shred of humiliation as she slowly extracted a crumpled $5 bill and 3 crisp $1 bills. She placed the money perfectly flat on the counter, smoothing out the wrinkled corners with her rough, calloused fingers. She signed the official deed with a steady, unflinching hand.
She owned it. Clara walked out of the brightly lit, sterile office building, clutching the flimsy paper that was now her absolute fortress. She walked the 3 miles back to the dark, suffocating woods, her bleeding feet moving with a strange, renewed purpose. When she finally stepped back into the freezing, trash-filled ruin, she did not look at the garbage or the shattered glass. She walked straight toward the massive, imposing limestone fireplace dominating the center of the room. She picked up a discarded, relatively clean cloth from the floor and slowly began to wipe away the thick, suffocating layers of black soot and gray dust covering the mantel. As the grime fell away beneath her bruised fingers, the sharp, highly trained eyes of a woman who had spent 38 years examining microscopic details suddenly caught a strange, unnatural line in the masonry. It was not a crack from the settling foundation, nor was it a random chip in the stone. It was entirely deliberate. She leaned in closer, her breath catching in the freezing air, realizing that the solid stone was not completely solid at all.
The deliberate line in the limestone was not a secret door, but rather the flawless, masterful seam of a perfectly constructed keystone. Clara stepped back, letting her eyes trace the massive, imposing structure of the chimney as it rose 20 feet into the dark, vaulted ceiling. Beneath the thick, suffocating layers of 15 years of accumulated grime, spider webs, and rotting animal nests, the true, enduring skeleton of the abandoned cabin began to reveal itself to her highly trained, observant eyes. It was an absolute architectural masterpiece. She looked up. The main support beams were not the cheap, flimsy 2x4s favored by modern, impatient builders. They were massive, solid white oak logs measuring a full 14 inches across, stripped of their bark and cured by decades of dry forest air. They spanned the entire 30-foot length of the main room without a single terrifying sag in the center. She walked slowly toward the nearest corner, her bleeding feet numb to the agonizing sting, and ran her rough, dirt-caked fingers over the wooden joints. There were no rusting iron nails holding the heavy walls together. The unknown builder had meticulously carved deep, interlocking mortise and tenon joints, driving heavy wooden pegs through the center to lock the massive logs together in a tight, unyielding embrace that even a hurricane could not tear apart. The foundation had not shifted a single inch. Clara moved silently through the dim, freezing ruin, her quiet footsteps disturbing thick, gray clouds of ancient dust. Barnaby followed at a slow, respectful distance, his crippled leg dragging softly against the debris. She found the kitchen area in the back corner, completely stripped of any valuable metal appliances, leaving only a decaying wooden counter and a series of deep, dark built-in shelves. She reached into the shadowed recess, her calloused hand brushing against something hard, smooth, and shockingly cold. She pulled it out into the pale light. It was a heavy, thick glass mason jar, securely sealed with a rusted zinc lid and completely coated in a greasy layer of black dirt. Clara wiped the grime away with the rough hem of her gray wool cardigan. Inside the glass, perfectly preserved in the airtight vacuum, were tightly packed clusters of dried, pale green leaves and small, shriveled purple flowers. A faded, yellowed paper label was glued carefully to the front, bearing elegant, looping cursive handwriting written in faded blue ink. "Echinacea purpurea," she whispered softly, her voice filled with a profound, quiet reverence. She quickly reached back into the dark shelf, her breathing growing slightly heavier, and pulled out another jar, then another, and then 3 more. There were dozens of them. The shelves were entirely lined with perfectly preserved, meticulously labeled botanical specimens. There were heavy jars of dried valerian root, tall bundles of sweetgrass, carefully separated willow bark, and crushed chamomile flowers. The scent of the dry herbs faintly penetrated the rusted lids, carrying with it a sudden, overwhelming wave of memories.
half a century ago, before she had ever picked up a piece of white chalk to teach a classroom of restless children, Clara had been a quiet, observant little girl following the slow, deliberate footsteps of her grandmother Matilda through the dense, towering forests of the Appalachian foothills. Matilda had not been a doctor, but her rough, soil-stained hands possessed a profound, ancient knowledge of the earth. She had taught Clara exactly how to identify the serrated edge of a wild yarrow leaf, how to carefully harvest the deep taproot of a dandelion without snapping it, and how to steep stinging nettle into a bitter, dark green tea that could break a deadly fever. This forsaken cabin was not a pile of rotting garbage. It was a forgotten, sleeping sanctuary. The person who had built this place, who had carefully gathered and labeled these precious herbs, possessed the exact same quiet, enduring reverence for the earth that Matilda had possessed. Clara stood in the center of the ruined kitchen, clutching the heavy glass jar of echinacea against her chest, her mind suddenly crystal clear. The cruel, greedy faces of Desmond and Evelyn faded completely from her memory, replaced by the solid, unyielding reality of the oak beams in the limestone hearth. They had stripped her of her polished floors and her comfortable heated bedroom, but they had unknowingly handed her the keys to a forgotten kingdom. She would not die here. She carefully placed the glass jars back on the sturdy wooden shelf, organizing them by the elegant, fading labels. She looked around the massive, terrifying disaster of the ruined cabin. The cold wind howled violently through the shattered, empty window frames, tearing through the room and biting brutally into her fragile, 73-year-old bones. The floor was a hazardous, filthy landscape of rotting leaves and broken glass, and the front porch was entirely swallowed by 50 pounds of creeping, parasitic ivy. The structural skeleton was an absolute masterpiece. Yet knowing the profound value of this hidden sanctuary was merely the very first agonizing step. To actually strip away 15 years of relentless decay, to violently rip the parasitic vines from the walls, and to completely seal the home against the fast-approaching, freezing winter. She was staring at a brutal, merciless sentence of stoic, back-breaking hard labor that threatened to drain every single ounce of her fading, fragile life force.
Clara did not utter a single syllable of complaint to the empty, freezing air. She stepped out onto the rotting wooden porch, pulling her thin gray cardigan tightly across her chest against the biting, relentless morning chill. The temperature hovered unforgivingly at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, stinging her cheeks and turning her breath into thick, white plumes of frost. She walked into the dense tree line, carefully navigating around thick patches of thorny briars. She gathered over 24 thick, dry hickory branches, snapping them to uniform lengths of exactly 30 inches, using nothing but her bare, bruised hands and the leverage of her own knee. She found a tough, fibrous strip of wild grapevine hanging from an ancient oak. She stripped the leaves, bound the thick cluster of hickory branches tightly together, and pulled the vine until it dug deeply into the calloused flesh of her palms. It was a crude, heavy, primitive broom. She returned to the cabin and began to sweep. The physical exertion was absolute, unmitigated torture. She pushed heavy mounds of accumulated rot, shattered glass, rusted bottle caps, and damp, heavy oak leaves toward the front door. Every single thrust of the heavy hickory broom sent a sharp, piercing shockwave of lactic acid fire burning through her 73-year-old shoulders. The broken, weeping blisters on her heels cracked open further with every single step, seeping fresh, warm blood straight through the thin cotton of her socks and staining the inside of her worn leather shoes. She did not stop. She established a brutal, rhythmic, punishing cadence of sweeping. She pushed a pile of garbage forward, paused for exactly 3 seconds to catch her shallow, ragged breath, and immediately pushed again.
She worked for 4 continuous hours without a single drop of water. She swept until the massive 30-foot length of the main room was completely stripped down to the original pale oak floorboards. By noon, the crippled, loyal hound could no longer stand. Barnaby collapsed near the massive limestone hearth, whining softly as his arthritic joints swelled to the size of small apples in the freezing, relentless draft cutting through the shattered windows. Clara dropped the heavy broom. She knelt beside him on the hard, unyielding wood, gently stroking his snowy gray muzzle. She walked over to the deep-shadowed pantry shelves and carefully selected 2 specific heavy glass jars. One contained the dried, twisted roots of the comfrey plant, and the other held a thick, dark golden liquid meticulously labeled as arnica oil. She walked out to the yard and found a heavy, smooth river stone weighing exactly 5 pounds. Using the heavy stone as a primitive, brutal mortar against a concave piece of split oak, she ground 2 thick ounces of the brittle comfrey root into a fine, pale dust. She mixed it slowly, meticulously, with exactly 3 tablespoons of the potent, pungent arnica oil, stirring it with a clean twig until it formed a thick, dark green paste. She tore a long, broad strip of soft cotton directly from the hem of her spare navy dress. "Hold still, my brave boy," she whispered tenderly. She applied the heavy, dark poultice directly to Barnaby's swollen, crippled hind leg, massaging the potent herbal mixture deep into the fur before wrapping the cotton fabric tightly around the inflamed joint. Within 20 short minutes, the powerful natural analgesic took effect. The old dog stopped his violent shivering, let out a long, heavy sigh, and fell into a deep, completely painless sleep. The relentless, rhythmic sound of her crude hickory broom scraping against the oak floorboards drifted out into the silent, dense forest. It carried exactly half a mile down the nameless dirt road, finally reaching the weathered, unpainted porch of a small, isolated farm. Silas was a quiet, profoundly solitary man. He had farmed 40 acres of hard, unforgiving Tennessee soil for over 50 years, his face carved into deep, permanent canyons by decades of blazing sun and freezing winter wind. He heard the strange, rhythmic scraping. He walked slowly up the overgrown path to the ruined cabin, stopping perfectly still at the edge of the tree line. He watched her. He watched the elderly woman dragging a heavy, rotting, waterlogged mattress out the front door, her knuckles completely split open and bleeding freely, her silver hair plastered to her forehead with cold sweat, her lined face a magnificent mask of terrifying, unbroken resolve. Silas did not step forward to offer empty, meaningless words of pity. He knew exactly what pride looked like. He turned around without a sound, walked the half-mile back to his quiet farm, and returned an hour later. He carried a heavy metal thermos, a bundle of fresh pine boards cut precisely to 6 feet in length, and a heavy canvas pouch filled with exactly 5 pounds of thick, galvanized steel nails. He walked up to the porch, placing the heavy items silently on the edge of the clean wood. Clara stopped dragging the mattress. She stood up straight, wiping the dirt from her cheek, and looked the old farmer directly in the eyes. "Eat the soup before it gets cold," he muttered gruffly. He turned and walked away. Clara sat on the edge of the porch, unscrewing the heavy metal lid. Thick, glorious steam billowed into the freezing air. It was a rich, heavy beef stew, loaded with thick chunks of potato and sweet carrots. She ate it slowly, feeling the immense, life-saving heat spread deep into her shivering chest. She looked at the pine boards and the heavy steel nails. A profound, silent gratitude swelled in her throat. The weeks dragged on in a grueling, relentless blur of manual labor.
Clara patched the shattered, empty windows with thick, translucent plastic sheeting she had found discarded in a deep ditch 2 miles down the highway, nailing the plastic tightly to the wooden frames to finally block the freezing wind. She scrubbed the massive limestone hearth with handfuls of coarse river sand until her fingernails cracked and bled, finally succeeding in clearing the blocked chimney. She lit a small, life-saving fire using dry pine needles and broken twigs, bringing the interior temperature up to a bearable, wonderful 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, the relentless silence of the woods was violently shattered. The heavy roar of a modern engine echoed through the trees, tires crunching loudly against the dry dirt. A heavy, expensive black truck parked abruptly at the edge of the clearing. Julian, her 35-year-old son, stepped out into the thick mud. He had been a thoughtless, selfish young man, easily manipulated by his sister Evelyn's venomous, greedy whispers. But the suffocating, crushing guilt of abandoning his own mother to the unforgiving streets had finally broken his cowardly spirit. He had spent 3 agonizing weeks tracking the transfer records at the county office. He walked slowly toward the porch. His eyes widened in absolute staggering shock at the sight of the transformed, clean cabin, the plastic windows, the smoking chimney, and the terrifying, hardened, absolute authority radiating from her mother's eyes. He fell heavily to his knees, right in the muddy dirt. "I am so sorry, Mother," he sobbed brokenly. Clara did not rush forward to embrace him. She did not offer a warm, comforting smile, nor did she hand out immediate, cheap, meaningless forgiveness. She looked down at him with immense, silent dignity, her bloody, calloused hands resting firmly on her hips. The wind whipped her gray cardigan around her small frame. "Get up," she stated coldly. Julian looked up, his face stained with dirty tears. "Tears will not fix the broken roof," she added evenly. Julian wiped his face, nodding silently. He understood exactly what was required. He stripped off his expensive gray suit jacket, throwing it carelessly into the mud. He walked straight to the back of his heavy truck, pulling out a heavy aluminum extension ladder, 80 pounds of thick asphalt roofing shingles, and a heavy canvas pouch filled with exactly 5 pounds of thick, galvanized steel nails.
For the next 14 days, he did not speak a single word of complaint. He climbed 20 feet into the air every single morning. He worked brutally under the scorching afternoon sun and the freezing morning frost, tearing away the rotting wood and driving thousands of heavy steel nails into the new shingles until his own hands were raw, bleeding, and entirely blistered. He rebuilt the shattered front porch, replacing the broken rails with solid, heavy cedar posts that smelled strongly of sharp resin. He matched her stoic, unbroken silence with his own grueling, desperate, back-breaking penance. They ate their sparse meals in quiet understanding, the bond slowly repairing itself not through words, but through the shared, undeniable shedding of blood and sweat. The cabin was finally breathing again. The draft was entirely sealed, the roof was perfectly sound, and Barnaby was walking with a steady, confident gait, his crippled leg entirely healed by the potent, ancient magic of the comfrey root. On a quiet, overcast Tuesday afternoon, Clara decided to tackle the final untouched corner of the massive main room. It was the dark, shadowy alcove directly beneath the heavy, rusted metal frame of her canvas cot. She asked Julian to help her drag the awkward metal frame out into the absolute center of the room. She knelt down on the clean floor, using her thick hickory broom to sweep away a dense, heavy pile of hardened mud, dead spiders, and decaying oak leaves that had accumulated in the very back corner. She scrubbed the wood with a damp rag. The floorboards here were entirely different. They were not laid in long, continuous 30-foot parallel lines like the rest of the massive cabin.
They were cut into precise, neat, highly deliberate squares, measuring exactly 36 inches across. Clara dropped her heavy broom. She ran her calloused, rough fingers along the heavy layer of dust, tracing the undeniable, deliberate outline of a heavy iron hinge completely buried in the grime. She pressed her fingernails deeply into the tight, narrow seam, scraping away the dirt and packed earth until she felt a recessed, heavy iron ring sitting flush with the wood. She grabbed the cold metal ring with both hands, bracing her leather boots against the solid floor, and pulled upward with all of her remaining hard-earned strength. The heavy wooden square groaned violently. It fought fiercely against 15 long years of accumulated rust, dampness, and absolute neglect. It broke free with a loud, terrifying, cracking snap that echoed off the high ceiling. A sudden, violent burst of stale, freezing, mineral-scented air rushed up aggressively from the deep earth below. Clara stared down into the gaping, pitch-black hole. Her heart began to hammer wildly against her ribs, echoing in her ears, as she realized the massive, heavy trapdoor did not just reveal a shallow storage space, but an ancient, stone-lined set of stairs leading straight down into a deep, terrifying abyss.
Clara did not hesitate. She instructed Julian to fetch the heavy brass flashlight from the glove compartment of his truck. He returned quickly, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and intoxicating curiosity. He clicked the heavy switch. A piercing beam of bright yellow light cut through the absolute suffocating darkness of the deep hole, illuminating exactly 12 steep, rough-hewn limestone steps leading straight down into the earth. The air rising from the abyss was shocking, a dense, perfectly preserved chill that hovered precisely at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling strongly of dry clay and ancient sleeping roots. Clara descended first. Her bruised hands gripped the cold, damp stone walls for absolute balance. Julian followed closely behind, his heavy leather boots thudding softly against the limestone. They reached the bottom, stepping onto a perfectly level floor made of tightly packed dry earth. Julian swept the bright beam of the flashlight across the hidden underground chamber. It was a classic, flawlessly constructed root cellar, measuring exactly 12 feet by 14 feet, lined entirely with thick, impenetrable slate to keep out the destroying moisture of the groundwater. It was completely empty, except for a single, heavy object sitting in the absolute center. Resting on a thick, waist-high block of solid white oak was a massive rectangular tin box. It was covered with a thick gray shroud of undisturbed dust, completely untouched by human hands or the destructive teeth of forest rodents for precisely 15 years. It was not a pirate's chest overflowing with gleaming, heavy gold coins, nor was it a bank vault filled with crisp, bundled stacks of $100 bills that greedy, pathetic men like Desmond would desperately kill to possess. It was something infinitely more valuable. Clara walked slowly toward the center of the cold room. She blew away the thick layer of gray dust, revealing a dull, oxidized silver surface. A heavy brass latch secured the front, completely unrusted thanks to the absolute zero humidity of the masterful stone cellar. She placed her trembling, calloused fingers on the cold metal latch and flipped it open with a sharp, resounding click that echoed violently off the slate walls. She opened the heavy lid. Inside the massive tin box lay hundreds of small, meticulously organized glass vials and thick, wax-sealed brown paper envelopes. They were packed precisely in rows, cushioned by dried, yellowed cotton. Beside the massive collection of vials rested a thick, heavy book bound in cracked brown leather, its pages slightly warped by age. Tucked securely under the heavy leather cover was a single folded sheet of thick parchment paper, completely sealed with a deep crimson stamp of hardened wax. Clara picked up the letter.
She broke the brittle red wax with her thumbnail. She unfolded the crisp parchment, bringing it close to the bright beam of Julian's flashlight. The elegant, sweeping, cursive handwriting was immediately, hauntingly familiar. It was the exact same beautiful, faded blue ink that labeled the hundreds of glass jars of herbs in the kitchen directly above their heads. She began to read the silent words. "To the one who finally turns the iron ring," the letter began, the voice speaking across a vast 15-year chasm of time. "My name is Agnes, and if you are reading these words, my physical body has long returned to the soil, and my beloved cabin has waited patiently in the dark. I built this sanctuary with my own 2 hands, guided by the profound, quiet wisdom of my dearest, most beloved friend in this entire world, Matilda." Clara stopped breathing. The heavy parchment trembled slightly in her rough, scarred hands. Matilda! It was her grandmother, the woman who had taught her how to gently pull a dandelion taproot from the spring earth, the woman who had filled her childhood with the sharp, clean scent of wild peppermint and the deep, earthy aroma of crushed comfrey. She forced her eyes to continue reading. "Matilda and I shared a magnificent, quiet dream," Agnes had written, the ink pressing deeply into the thick paper. "We dreamed of a massive, healing sanctuary, a safe, enduring haven where the purest, oldest genetics of the earth could be fiercely protected from the reckless chemical poison of the modern world. I have spent my entire life gathering these precious, original seeds. They are entirely untouched, uncorrupted, and impossible to replace. When I learned of my approaching death 15 years ago, I sealed them in the cold stone. I left no legal will for the corrupt county to fight over. I simply walked away, knowing that the earth always calls its own back home. I left this land to the quiet patience of the forest, trusting absolutely that one day, when the time was perfectly right, the true bloodline of Matilda would find the hidden dirt road and claim what is rightfully theirs." The letter ended with a single, profound blessing. It was a staggering, absolute revelation. Clara stood perfectly still in the freezing 48-degree cellar. The pathetic, mocking laughter of the county clerk, the crushing $8 legal transfer fee, the agonizing, bloody blisters on her heels, and the overwhelming despair of her eviction vanished into thin air. She had not stumbled blindly onto a worthless piece of trash property carrying a forgotten tax debt. She had been quietly, inevitably drawn to a sacred bloodline inheritance. The magnificent, imposing oak skeleton above her head was not a ruin, but a fortress built specifically for her family. She looked down at the hundreds of tiny glass vials. To a hollow, greedy fool like Desmond, these tiny brown specks were completely worthless dirt. He would have kicked the heavy tin box aside in a desperate, pathetic rage, searching blindly for easily liquidated assets to feed his $68,000 gambling addiction. But Clara, armed with 38 years of sharp academic discipline and the ancient, quiet wisdom of her grandmother, knew the terrifying, immense truth. These were pure, uncorrupted heirloom seeds. They contained the exact ancient biological blueprints of medicinal plants that had been completely wiped out by decades of aggressive, commercial over-farming. They were a flawless, preserved botanical library of the natural world before it was altered, hybridized, and destroyed by careless, greedy hands. They were a living, breathing time capsule. Julian stared at the tiny seeds, completely unaware of the magnitude of their discovery. "Are they worth anything, Mother?" he whispered softly, his voice echoing in the small stone chamber. "Everything," Clara replied evenly. She carefully closed the heavy leather diary and placed it back into the massive tin box. She had walked away from her former life with precisely $27 in a battered leather wallet. She had purchased an abandoned, rotting kingdom for a laughable sum of exactly $8. Now she was standing guard over an ancient, sleeping fortune of unimaginable scale. The seeds seemed like mere sentimental keepsakes, yet the true, absolute value of this ancient genetic gold mine was so staggering that it would soon make even the most distinguished, decorated biological scientist tremble violently when he peered through the lens of a high-powered microscope.
Julian drove his heavy black trunk precisely 65 miles to the State University Agriculture Department. He carried the heavy leather diary and a single meticulously sealed glass vial containing 3 pale seeds. He returned precisely 48 hours later. Sitting in the passenger seat was Dr. Aris, a renowned botanical conservationist with a deeply lined face, a tailored tweed jacket, and sharp, analytical eyes. The distinguished scientist did not scoff at the muddy dirt road, nor did he mock the 73-year-old woman waiting quietly on the cedar porch. He gripped his heavy leather briefcase tightly. He stepped carefully down the 12 limestone steps into the freezing 48-degree root cellar. He stayed down there for 6 agonizing hours. Clara did not pace nervously across the 30-foot oak floorboards. She sat perfectly still in her rocking chair near the massive limestone hearth, her calloused fingers gently stroking Barnaby's warm, sleeping head. She listened to the muffled, heavy silence radiating from the earth below. When Dr. Aris finally emerged from the dark trapdoor, his immaculate white shirt was completely covered in gray dust. He was visibly trembling. He walked slowly toward the burning fire, completely ignoring the dirt on his clothes. He pulled his thick spectacles from his face, wiping the cold condensation from the lenses with a shaking hand. He looked at the elderly woman in the frayed gray cardigan with absolute, unmasked reverence. "I have spent my entire professional career searching for a single viable specimen of wild Appalachian ginseng," Dr. Aris whispered breathlessly, his voice breaking under the immense weight of his discovery. "You do not just have one seed, Clara. You have thousands." He placed his heavy briefcase on the oak floor. He explained the staggering absolute truth. The heavy tin box did not just hold seeds, it held the entirely uncorrupted original genetics of over 40 medicinal plant species that modern aggressive chemical farming had completely driven to absolute extinction over the last 50 years, a living, breathing time capsule. Combined with the pristine, unpolluted underground mineral spring flowing directly beneath the slate cellar, the abandoned cabin was a flawless, self-sustaining biological fortress. It was priceless. The University Research Institute is fully prepared to offer an immediate conservation grant, Dr. Aris stated formally, his sharp eyes fixed intensely on her calm, weathered face. They wish to purchase the propagation rights for the extinct seed lines and fund a permanent protected agricultural sanctuary on this exact land. The initial valuation is fully approved by the board of directors. He opened the brass clasps of his bag. He withdrew a crisp, beautifully printed legal document and laid it gently on the wooden table. The bold black ink spelled out an absolutely staggering, reality-altering figure. $1,200,000. A woman who had been violently thrown onto the unforgiving concrete exactly 2 months ago, clutching a battered suitcase and a pathetic sum of $27, was now holding a massive fortune. She had endured the bleeding blisters, the freezing drafts, and the absolute humiliation of being discarded by her own flesh and blood. She had rebuilt a ruined, rotting carcass of a building with her bare, bruised hands, a crude hickory broom, and immense, unbroken pride. She looked at the paper. She did not scream in triumph, nor did she fall to her knees weeping tears of overwhelming joy, nor did she perform a foolish, erratic dance of sudden wealth. She simply nodded her head once, her spine perfectly straight, her dignity completely unbroken. She calmly reached for a black pen and signed her name on the dotted line. She was a millionaire.
The quiet, dignified transaction should have remained completely buried in the silent depths of the oak forest, but massive state grants and groundbreaking botanical discoveries cannot be hidden forever. Within a mere fortnight, a brief but incredibly detailed article was published on the front page of the State Agricultural Journal, praising the immense discovery made by a previously unknown 73-year-old widow named Clara Whitmore. The scent of extreme wealth travels faster than a raging wildfire. It drifted down the roaring highways, completely bypassing the silent, peaceful woods until it slipped beneath the front door of a heavily mortgaged suburban house. It reached the greedy, frantic eyes of a pathetic man drowning in exactly $68,000 of gambling debt and the cowardly daughter who had blindly followed him into absolute moral ruin. The news of the $1,200,000 fortune hit the state papers, and the sudden, overwhelming stench of money rapidly summoned the parasitic traitors back to the forest, armed with a desperate, filthy scheme.
The heavy, arrogant crunch of expensive rubber tires violently shattered the sacred, peaceful silence of the dense oak forest. A sleek silver luxury sedan, heavily financed and completely out of place on the narrow dirt road, parked aggressively beside the new cedar porch. Desmond stepped out into the thick mud. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit, reeking of expensive cologne and desperate, suffocating greed. Evelyn followed closely behind him, her hands trembling nervously, her face a pathetic, carefully constructed mask of fake, rehearsed concern. They had driven exactly 65 miles from the sprawling suburbs the very second they read the State Agricultural Journal. Clara was kneeling in the soft brown earth of the front yard, using a small steel trowel to carefully plant a delicate row of wild peppermint. She wore her faded gray cardigan, her hands heavily caked in wet soil. Barnaby rested comfortably on the porch, his tail thumping rhythmically against the solid wooden boards. She did not look up. "Mother!" Evelyn cried out with a shrill theatrical sob, rushing toward the garden with her arms wide open. "We were so terribly worried about you." Clara slowly pushed the steel trowel 6 inches deep into the dirt. She stood up, brushing the soil from her knees, and looked at her daughter with absolute, terrifying emptiness. The woman who had callously thrown a battered suitcase out the front door exactly 2 months ago was now crying fake, invisible tears. Desmond stepped forward, adopting a false, sickeningly sweet tone of authority. "Clara, you have done a remarkable job cleaning up this little shack, but you are 73 years old, and living alone in the middle of the woods is severely affecting your mental faculties. We read all about the state grant. You cannot possibly manage $1,200,000 in your fragile, declining state." He pulled a thick white envelope from his tailored jacket. "We are filing an emergency petition for a medical conservatorship," Desmond stated coldly. "The court will clearly see you are senile. If you do not sign the grant money over to my management firm today, we will drag you before a judge and take absolute control of this entire estate." He was bluffing. Clara did not scream. She did not throw handfuls of wet mud at his expensive suit, nor did she curse the day he married her daughter. She calmly walked to an old wooden bucket, rinsed the heavy soil from her calloused hands, and dried them on a coarse cotton towel. She looked him directly in his arrogant, desperate eyes. "I will see you in court," she stated evenly. Exactly 30 days later, the heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung open. The massive room was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. The temperature inside the grand hall hovered at a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark contrast to the bitter cold Clara had endured in the forest. Desmond sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 2 expensive, aggressive lawyers hired entirely on credit. He wore a smug, arrogant smirk, fully believing his own elaborate, desperate lies. Evelyn sat beside him, nervously twisting a gold ring around her pale finger. Clara sat on the opposite side. She wore her sensible navy wool dress, her posture perfectly straight, her calloused hands resting quietly in her lap.
Beside her sat Julian, wearing his worn leather work boots and a simple canvas jacket, completely reformed and fiercely loyal to her mother. Desmond's lawyer stood up, delivering a loud, dramatic speech that lasted exactly 20 minutes. He spoke passionately about Clara's supposed dementia, her dangerous living conditions in an abandoned cabin, and her absolute inability to manage a complex, 7-figure botanical estate. He painted a pitiful picture of a helpless, confused old woman who desperately needed the firm, loving guidance of her successful son-in-law. Clara's attorney, a quiet, meticulous man with graying hair, slowly stood up. He did not yell or wave his arms in theatrical outrage. He calmly approached the heavy wooden bench and handed the presiding judge a thick, sealed manila folder weighing nearly 2 pounds. "Your Honor, my client does not suffer from cognitive decline. She suffers from the criminal, fraudulent actions of the man sitting across this room." The judge opened the folder. Inside was the original power of attorney document that Desmond had used to violently seize Clara's former home and sell it to cover his crippling $68,000 underground gambling debt. "We subpoenaed the medical records," the attorney continued, his voice echoing loudly in the silent, vaulted room. "The signature of the attending physician on that document is a complete, undeniable forgery. Furthermore, we have certified bank records proving Mr. Desmond illegally funneled the entire proceeds of the stolen property into offshore accounts." The color drained completely from Desmond's face. The arrogant, smug smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, sickening mask of absolute, paralyzing terror. He tried to stand up, his knees knocking weakly against the heavy wooden table, his breath hitched violently in his chest. He was destroyed. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with a violent, deafening crack. The sound echoed like a sharp gunshot through the cavernous hall. The judge glared fiercely at Desmond, his voice shaking with profound, unmasked disgust. "The petition for conservatorship is completely denied," the judge announced loudly, his words cutting through the air like a steel blade. "This court is freezing all financial assets belonging to the plaintiff. I am forwarding this forged document and these bank records directly to the federal prosecutor for immediate criminal indictment on charges of elder abuse, forgery, and wire fraud." 2 heavy-set bailiffs stepped forward, moving quietly but purposefully toward Desmond's table. Evelyn burst into genuine hysterical tears, realizing with crushing absolute certainty that she was entirely ruined. Her massive house, her expensive cars, and her hollow, fake social status were gone forever. She was completely bankrupt, chained to a convicted felon facing decades in federal prison, and thoroughly disgraced in front of the entire county. Clara stood up slowly. She did not laugh mockingly at their sudden, violent downfall, nor did she offer a single word of forgiveness, nor did she hurl angry insults at their broken forms. She simply looked at her weeping daughter and her terrified son-in-law with a profound, chilling pity. They were small, hollow creatures who had foolishly traded their entire souls for a fleeting, worthless illusion of power. She turned her back on them. She walked down the long center aisle of the courtroom, her flat leather shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Every single person in the gallery, from the hardened lawyers to the skeptical court clerks, stood up and silently parted ways to let her pass. Their eyes were filled with absolute, unbroken respect for the dignified, 73-year-old woman who had fought a silent, brutal war and won everything. The pathetic traitors were dragged out through the heavy back doors in absolute, humiliating defeat, leaving the vast world perfectly quiet and returning a permanent, undisturbed peace to the sacred sanctuary in the deep oak forest, where Clara was finally ready to witness the most magnificent golden sunrise of her entire life.
The massive state conservation grant of $1,200,000 cleared the local bank exactly 1 week after the trial. Clara did not purchase luxury silk dresses, nor did she ever consider moving into a sprawling, empty mansion in the wealthy suburbs. She did not hoard the sudden massive fortune for her own comfort. She invested every single penny directly back into the deep, breathing earth. Within 6 short months, the dense, choking woods surrounding the old cabin were carefully cleared by respectful local hands. They built 4 massive, gleaming glass greenhouses spanning over 2 full acres of the cleared property. These structures were meticulously equipped with precise climate controls to protect the fragile, ancient heirloom seeds during the bitter, freezing winters. Above the sturdy, new cedar porch, a beautifully carved white oak sign swung gently in the warm spring breeze. It proudly read, "The Matilda and Agnes Healing Garden." The sanctuary was not a commercial business. It provided pure, ancient medicinal botanicals entirely free of charge to any struggling family in the county who needed them. People from miles away drove down the newly graded dirt road to collect heavy glass jars of dried comfrey for aching joints or bundled sweet willow bark for terrible fevers. Silas, the quiet farmer who had brought her warm soup and 5 pounds of heavy steel nails during her absolute darkest hour, was now a permanent fixture at the flourishing property. He sat on the wide porch holding a steaming porcelain cup of hot chamomile tea. "The dark soil here is the absolute best I have ever seen in my 50 years of plowing," Silas remarked softly, his weathered, deeply lined eyes crinkling into a rare, genuine smile. Clara smiled back in comfortable silence. The late afternoon sun cast a long, magnificent golden glow across the rolling Tennessee hills. The evening temperature settled at a perfect, balmy 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Clara sat peacefully in a heavy, hand-carved oak rocking chair, the rhythmic creaking of the wood blending harmoniously with the distant, joyful laughter of visiting neighbors exploring the vast garden. At her feet, Barnaby let out a long, contented sigh. The 12-year-old hound, once crippled and shivering violently under a freezing canvas cot, now walked the expansive 40 acres with absolute, painless confidence. He gently nudged his warm, wet muzzle against her shin. Clara rested her rough, calloused hand gently on his head, staring out over the vibrant, blooming acres of purple echinacea and wild green peppermint. She had survived the absolute worst of human greed and cowardly betrayal. She had endured the bleeding, cracked blisters, the biting 45-degree nights, and the crushing, suffocating weight of being utterly discarded. She had rebuilt a ruined, rotting empire with her own 2 hands. She had turned absolute ashes into a living paradise. From an insulting, pathetic sum of exactly $8 that the entire civilized world had mocked, this magnificent, enduring wooden fortress had proven a silent, absolute truth. You must never underestimate the profound power of things that have been callously discarded. Your true, enduring value does not lie in the careless, greedy hands of those who throw you away into the cold dark. It lies entirely in your own terrifying, unyielding strength to fiercely take root, violently push through the hard earth, and brilliantly bloom in the most barren, unforgiving places.